Good evening and thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Debbie Helper and I'm the Administrative Vice President for the League of Women Voters of Santa Fe County. We are a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization promoting voter education, voter participation, and good government. Tonight we've joined forces with the New Mexico Foundation for Open Government, a nonpartisan nonprofit that explicitly works to ensure government transparency through open meetings and open records. Together, we're celebrating Sunshine Week, which is held annually in mid-March to coincide with the birthday of James Madison, author of our Constitution's Bill of Rights and known as the father of open government. We call it Sunshine Week to remind ourselves that, as Supreme Court Justice William Brandeis once said, sunshine is the best disinfectant. In other words, government serves us best when the sun shines into all the nooks and crannies, and we, the people, know what is being done in our name. All 50 states plus the federal government have sunshine laws to ensure government transparency through open meetings and open records. Perhaps you've heard of the Freedom of Information Act. That's the name for the federal open records law. In New Mexico, our comparable law is called the Inspection of Public Records Act, and that's the focus of tonight's panel discussion. IPRA, as it's called, requires every government entity from the tiniest municipality to the largest state agency to allow the public to inspect most records, and it outlines a procedure for doing so. Every New Mexican has a stake in protecting IPRA, whether you use it regularly yourself or benefit from its use by others on your behalf. Laws like this promote government accountability and public participation in the democratic process. To explore this more, we've assembled a panel of 3 New Mexicans who use IPRA regularly. I'll introduce our moderator, Inez Russell Gomez, in 1 minute, but I'd like to remind you there'll be a Q&A after the panel, and we have index cards to write your questions on, and those can be presented to Inez for further conversation. So without further ado, this is Inez Russell Gomez, opinion editor at Santa Fe New Mexican, where she writes editorials and produces both an editorial page in print and a weekly podcast. She's a native of New Mexico and got her start in journalism, distributing the Las Vegas Optic. She has a bachelor's degree in journalism from Texas Tech University and a master's degree in communication and public affairs from the American University in Washington, D.C. I'll let her introduce the rest of the panel. Please welcome Inez.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for giving up some of your St. Patrick's Day to be here. I will start with Amanda because she's the only person on this panel that I haven't worked with professionally. Amanda Lavin is the legal director for the New Mexico Foundation for Open Government and has been a past public defender at both the state and federal level. She is a graduate of the University of Montana Bozeman for her undergraduate and the University of New Mexico School of Law. And she can tell us, I hope, about what legal matters people need to know about in terms of their public records and the government's really increasing proclivity to hide what they're doing. One of the things, I'm so old that when I started as a reporter in 1982 in San Angelo, Texas, we used to go get something called the hot sheets. And those are police reports. And they were kept in a binder at the front desk of the police shop. And you would go in, you'd wave at the cops, and then you would sit on the floor and you'd go through it by hand. And everything was there except maybe they would mark out somebody's social security number, if that. And today they put hot sheets online and they mark out almost anything abuse, and they don't put all of them out. And if you're a citizen of Santa Fe and you want to know where the burglary rings are operating or where there's been increased reports of sexual assaults, it's going to be really hard to find that out because that kind of information is just not there anymore. But somebody who searches for it is Phaedra Haywood. She is the native New Mexican who covers courts and corrections at the New Mexican, and she has worked there since 1999 and really has used IPRA, the Inspection of Public Records Act, to find out a lot of stuff that the people in charge do not want you to know. So she'll talk to you about how she uses that act and it helps her do her job. I think the series you guys did on medical treatment in prisons and public records that they got, and one of the things that's happening when you privatize government, let's say you get a contract with a big fancy medical company to come treat all the people in jail. Well, they're gonna say, we're not a public body, we don't have to tell you. Well, we pay them with our dollars, and yet they're going to hide the fact that they're letting people die or treating them poorly. Finally, we have Christine Barber, who has a really, I think, exciting job now. She is a journalist who started at the University of Florida, which has one of the best journalism undergrad programs in the country. She worked in Gallup, Santa Fe, and Albuquerque newspapers. And since November, she has been executive director of the New Mexico Foundation for Open Government. She answers more than 50 calls a month from regular New Mexicans trying to access public records. But instead of accessing them, they find that the government doesn't want to give the information that you paid for. One of the things that I think, maybe Christine, we'll start with you and you can talk about, is how during this legislative session, all of the bills that I saw dealing with public records basically were trying to stop you from getting more information. I think they've all pretty much failed at this point, so that was good. But why are our lawmakers, including like, you know, nice liberal ones that supposedly are for being progressive and transparency, why are they saying if you want records, you have to pay for them, or you can only use them and we'll decide if you're using them the right way? So talk about the session and how lousy it was. Oh, use the microphone.
So hi, everybody. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm not sure the microphone is doing much, but maybe it is. So yeah, the legislative session feels like it's been going on forever. There were 3 bills. Well, there was 4 bills that directly rewrote the Inspection of Public Records Act. For those who aren't familiar with it or haven't had a chance to read it as many times as Amanda and I have, which she's read it much more, we actually brought copies of it. They're in a little pamphlet in the back if you wanted to look it over at all. So the act itself is basically just, it tells you exactly what public records are, tells you what exemptions there are, like why certain ones can't be given out, for instance, like trade secrets, or if you are, you know, if you have infrastructure of a water system that, you know, could be hit by terrorists, don't give out that information. It also tells you what a custodian, records custodian, those are the people who handle the records, what they're supposed to do with records, how to give them out, and then they say how you're supposed to request a record, so how you go about doing it. So that law, which is called IPRA, that was the law that these 4 bills would have rewritten. Now, one of them would not have rewritten it much, and actually was the one that I think has gone almost all the way through now. That one puts another exemption in, which it says you can't give out the home address and other personal information of an abortion provider who works for the government. So we didn't have an objection to that. We gave them some, Amanda, I say we, like I helped. Amanda gave them suggestions about how they could change the wording of the bill. So that one we didn't get involved with. The other 3 significantly rewrote IPRA. So it put in more exemptions of more things that you should not be able to get. It put in, all 3 of them added costs. So right now, you are basically only charged if you're getting paper copies. Or in a couple other instances, if you're requesting so much information that they have to put it on, they can't just send it digitally, they have to put it on a thumb drive, that you get charged for as well. But other than that, it's free.
Because we already paid for it.
Yeah, so you are the taxpayer and pay for it. I'm always looking at Amanda for this part because I always end up saying it wrong. And so you'll correct me if I said that wrong, right?
That was
okay, thank you. So, but they're free. So like you get in a car accident and you need your police report in order to give it to your insurance company, that's free. But these 3 laws, all 3 of them would have charged in some way, shape, or form. 2 of them would have charged everybody $30 an hour to get your public records. The last one would have only charged businesses to get $30 an hour. But those businesses were things like, I talked to several genealogists. That's their, you know, that's something they love. They made it into their business, their personal one. They would have gone out of business if they would have had to get charged $30 an hour. Same for architects, small architecture firms, or other places that are always requesting public records. Fortunately, it took a lot of work. But fortunately, all three of those ones that would have rewritten IPRA, the sponsors of the bill, after a very long while, actually only last week, the session's over on Saturday, only last week they decided that they are not going to go continue forward with them. We have been fighting those every day and weekends since January. So it was quite the relief. Again, I'm new at my job. As far as I understand it, that there hasn't been that kind of push forward to rewrite the entire law in a long time. It's a reflection of how overworked the custodians are. They have seen their record requests go up astronomically. And there are a lot of the records they're doing are for businesses like LexisNexis, which is you ask them online, can you get me this? Or insurance company says, can you get this stuff for me? They go ask for public records from custodian and then they sell them. So they're making money off of it.
But Amanda, let's follow up with that. Couldn't they get a database or a system where the records would be online and then the person who wants them could search for them themselves? Like, why do we have to have a records custodian anyway if this is work paid for by the public and isn't a trade secret or something where you wouldn't release it? So why haven't they written laws to try to do that?
I think that's a good question. And I think it really kind of comes down to there's so many different types of records out there. And so I think the argument against that for every single type of record that's in existence is that you can't just put everything online because that would just be an inordinate amount of work. And there's always going to be information that needs to be redacted, and every type of record is different. And once something is available on the internet and just sort of free to access and distribute in any manner, I think there are some sort of ethical questions that come into play there. But for specific types of records, we think that is a really excellent solution. For example, Christine was started to talk about these requests from big companies like LexisNexis, who are otherwise known as sort of a data broker company. And we looked at the kind of records after talking to different agencies who respond to these requests. We asked what kind of records are they getting, and it's really just a sort of limited type of record, and that's crash reports from local police. So when a vehicle is involved in a crash, a police officer will write a report, and those are the types of records, for the most part, that these companies are making these really vast requests for. And so actually the city of Santa Fe has been sort of exemplary in terms of addressing this issue, and they have now dedicated, that's what their records department does now, is they preemptively seek out these crash reports. They have already sort of an online system of getting access to them in the first place, that's run by the Department of Transportation, and they get the reports, they redact the information that they need to, and then they just put them online. And I think you have to know some search terms and other things to get them, but they're publicly available, and you don't have to go through a sort of gatekeeper of information or the records custodian who's supposed to facilitate that access. So it's really made their lives a lot easier, is what we understand after talking to the people who work for the IPRA department in Santa Fe. And so those are the kinds of solutions that we think that public bodies should be looking at, and maybe the legislature, to make sure that when we modernize IPRA and take into account this whole new landscape of electronic records and what that means and how many more records there are and how much easier it is to disseminate information and that sort of thing. We should be looking at how do we still make this information available, but not make it feasible to comply with IPRA on behalf of the government, but also not make it so you can't get the information that you're entitled to.
And to be fair to the government, if you've got 3 staffers doing nothing but answering record requests for LexisNexis or the crash lawyer down the street, that's a hard use of their time. So I've always felt for them, but at the same time, a lot of that information could just be out there and they wouldn't have to. Phaedra, obviously you're a beat reporter. In the olden days, when I was reporting, you would call somebody and say, hey, what about this? And they would say, oh, I'll send that to you. And I didn't have to put in a request. And I didn't have to talk to a PR person. But that's different now, isn't it? Most things you have to be more formal. Unless you have really good sources, but a lot of things are still really formalized. And how does that affect you when you're reporting a story?
Well, that's one of the reasons that I wanted to speak about this today. I don't love public speaking about anything except for this. Because this is the most elegant, efficient, and direct way to find out what your government is doing, despite the myriad of attempts from all types of people to shroud that information or gatekeep that information. You don't need to ask anyone's permission. You don't need to have their agreement that you are allowed to have it, anything like that. You can think of anything you want and just straight ask them. I mean, Inez's example of the hot sheets. I used to go do the hot sheets and we would go to the cop shop and sit outside waiting for them to open the door, sometimes for hours, but we would get a chance to look at those hot sheets handwritten by the police and their first impression. And now it's a CAD printout with just the title of the crime, like unattended vehicle. Then you have to request that report. They can make you wait 3 days, 15 days, 30 days. So it's much more cumbersome, but it's still so magical in what you can actually get. And, you know, Inez mentioned a project that a colleague and I did in 2016. We were trying to, you know, look into the quality of healthcare in the prison system. And we asked them for their audits going back 10 years. When they gave us the records, they put me in a room with 20 boxes full of pieces of paper. And part of the two things they're trying to do there, sort of baffle you with BS and take up your time, but also sort of threaten you that it's gonna cost a lot. And the idea, like, the information is free, the copies cost, but the information is totally free. So I went in there and I took pictures of every single piece of paper. It took me 8 hours, and then I went and I had to copy them all, and that cost $300. And then I recreated 10 years worth of audit binders back at my office and was able to actually get to the point of seeing that they hadn't done their audits. So, you know, it does allow you, if you know how to work it, to do almost anything you want. And I wasn't really sure about the format of today's meeting, and it said that I was gonna tell you how I use it. That's one of the ways that I've used it. This year I won second place investigative reporting from New Mexico Press Association for a story about a police dog that bit the police officer who had been pressed into acting as a suspect during a training. Well, I have read all the background on all the dogs on the force and found out he had bit more people than anyone else on the force. And then he had actually already bitten someone else on the head when this officer was told, don't go get your helmet. This dog's trained not to bite on the head. In the video that I received through the IPRA, he could be heard saying, the suspect could be heard saying, he bit me on the head. So, you know, it is a way to get past sort of the party line that they're trying to tell you. And so I wanted to give you a couple of my own tips for using IPRA, but also if there's a Q&A later, if any of you have any burning questions about your government, big or small, city, state, county, we could take one as an example and talk about how do you get there. One of the tips that I have for putting in a request, number one, an oral request counts. You can ask a public official for something and they should be responsive to that, but it's not enforceable with the legal penalties, which are $100 a day if you win a case against them for not doing it. So in order for it to be enforceable under the law, you have to do it in writing. It doesn't have to be fancy. Some of these agencies have a portal, which is a whole nother discussion because it's helpful in some ways and unhelpful in other ways to digitize these requests. But generally, if you find out the name of the records custodian, you can just send them the email. And always in my language, I always ask to review the records that I'm looking for, not for copies. That way they can't charge you. And then I also specify at the end, I say, you know, I'm asking you to provide these records digitally free of charge. If that's not possible, when the records are available, let me know. I'll arrange a time to come view the hard copy, like I did with the prison. And that usually scares them off. They don't want you to come review the hard copy. That takes time out of their schedule. But usually any threats of thousands of dollars worth of fees will go away if you tell them you just want to come look at them. So those are some things I have to share about it.
Those are really good, Phaedra. Christine, what kind of calls do you get? I mean, because everyone should remember that IPRA isn't just for journalists or media people, it's for everybody. And regular people might get records about how their kids were treated in jail or, you know, if they were in the children and youth system or something, there's a lot of that's private, but there's some things that are public. So what do people call you to ask you about?
So we run a helpline, and I am the person that answers it. And so when people are doing records requests, honestly, it's sometimes journalists, majority though, it's regular people. They're trying to get, the records that they're asking for are all over the place. Sometimes they're trying to get information about a new subdivision that's being built next door to them, so they can figure out what's going on. And that when they put in the IPRA request, they were told, you know, this is all the information we have, when they know that there's other stuff. And how do they get at that? They, you know, there's, you know, and it's from all over the state. So like Santa Rosa, Gallup, Grant, Silver City, like everybody. We have people who are concerned that a school district isn't doing its job. So they're trying to get all of their agendas and minutes, and then wonder why they're not put online. And so they're having to put IPRA requests in for that. And so it is this extraordinary width and breadth. But all of them have the same problem, which is they can't get the records they want. And the reasons they can't are really varied. A lot of the time it's because that the communication between them and the records custodian just isn't good. But there are instances where the records custodian is not actually doing their job. They're not paying attention to the law, and they're not giving them the records that they need. And so that's where we start to come in. And so a lot of the stuff we have to do with also is when there's this exception. So the records, when you put in a records request, so let's say it's really interesting, by the way, you should totally do it. And you can do it all online, like they were saying that you can do on forums and stuff. So you can just go to their webpage for whatever organization you want to. You even have ones for like, you know, soil and conservation districts, things like that. They all have to follow this. Go to their website, click on the little link, and then they walk you through, this is what you're, just say what you're asking for. But I forgot where it's going. Oh, they have a limited amount of time though. So they're supposed to do it, they're supposed to get the record immediately, but nobody gets the record immediately. And then the maximum is supposed to be 15 days. That's not 15 business days, that's 15 calendar days for you to get your record. But unfortunately, because a lot of the records custodians are so overworked, they're using this thing in the law that's, it's not an exception, but it's a designation, which is excessively burdensome and broad. That's what they tell you when they need more time. And they do a lot of times need more time because these things sometimes are not simple to find. However, in some cases, we have definitely found they say that with the hopes that you'll never contact them again and that you'll kind of give up.
One of the surprises is a former colleague of ours became a records custodian in a law enforcement agency. I'll be vague. And she said she was never so surprised as when they sat in a room and her boss said, well, how can we figure out how to keep this from the press or from a lawyer or from whatever? And they actively sought to hide records using every legal exception they could. But their first inclination wasn't that, oh, I'll send this over. So sometimes one of the reasons cases get dropped is because those agencies aren't getting records, not just to the public, but to actual lawyers and things like that. So it's kind of an interesting, that was a really shocking thing for me. And she was a former journalist, so she was just like, oh my gosh, it was not a successful marriage.
There are also custodians who really take it, they really see their job as like imperative and like really helpful, and they see their job for what it is, which is actually like protecting the pillars of democracy, because that is what they're doing. Because without these records requests, Phaedra has proven this, and Inez did, and when she's been reporting, and Amanda does too when she does her lawsuits and stuff, is that they're defending these pillars of democracy, because if we don't know what the government is doing, this is how we find out. And so you would hope that all of them would have that mindset, that it's like fantastic that people want records, but that isn't always the case, because work is hard, so.
Amanda, what kind of advice do you give to people who ask you, how can I get this faster? And what are they looking for usually?
I guess it really just depends on the situation, but I think if you are really looking for something quickly, try to narrow your request as much as possible. And if it's maybe several different things that you're looking for, and it's probably all gonna be part of one request, let the person that you're communicating with, which should be the records custodian of the public agency, know like what's sort of a priority. So if you're asking for a bunch of different communications about a certain subject, but you also want like a specific contract, and you really want to look at the contract first, because it might take a long time for them to dig up all of the emails that are going to be responsive to your request or something like that. I would suggest is just as much communication with the records custodian as possible and try to just be specific and narrow to the extent that you can. But I also think just being a squeaky wheel, I think like Christine said, unfortunately, because there are so many people who contact the government wanting to look at documents and submitting these IPRA requests, there's a tendency for these agencies to feel overwhelmed by this, even though it's an essential function of government is to have a records custodian and allow inspection of these records. We often hear that it's difficult and a drain on their resources. And so if you are there just making a lot of noise and making sure that they know that you are keeping on your request, that's who's gonna get a response.
And you can ask that it be produced in a rollout, but you can also make separate requests. So it's good to communicate, but sometimes depending on who you're dealing with, whether or not they really do consider themselves a public servant and honor that position, that doesn't help you much. So if you put specific requests though, they have specific separate deadlines. So say you want the contract, but you also want all the applicants. Well, the applicants are gonna take a lot longer. So you request the contract in one email and you request all the applicants in another email. And they will try and give you the runaround about, another 90 days, another 90 days, another broad and burdensome. You can sue them, and Foundation for Open Government has joined the New Mexican in suits over records that have created case law in New Mexico. But that can be expensive and it can be hard to prove your damages if you're trying to collect $100 a day. So one other option for sort of cutting through that is, and it's not speedy, but it is free, is you can file a complaint with the Attorney General's office if you don't get your records. The Attorney General's office is tasked with enforcing this law, and filing a complaint with them is free. So it does start to put pressure on the agency.
If you do that though, and you decide to, let's say you get the overly broad burdensome thing, and then you still don't hear back from them, you still don't hear back from them, and you ask them and go, what's going on? You don't hear anything. Or you get to the 15-day mark, which they have to follow, and which is what I'm facing right now with Santa Fe County. They went past the 15-day mark and I'm like, what are you doing? You're not allowed to do that. And so I emailed and I asked what's going on and they're not responsive. That's when you can call us and we can talk you through it, and then we can send a letter on your behalf. Or you can go to the Department of Justice. But biggest thing, along with Phaedra's tips, sometimes you don't get a PDF when you're using the form online. Keep PDFs or keep screenshots of your original request. Because in order for us to help you, in order for Amanda to do her job and give you legal advice, and for our legal team to give you legal advice, in order for, is that correct, Amanda?
Kind of legal.
Okay, that's kind of legal. Best practices, yes.
Yeah.
And then for the Attorney General's office, if you want to file a complaint, they have to see what you literally said to see if they were responsive to your request. And they keep PDFs and screenshots of everything, all communications. Because if you call me, the first thing I'm going to ask for is all of that. And then I put together a timeline to find out where they have been responses and where they haven't been. That's what I was gonna say. Amanda had things she was gonna say as well.
Yeah, those are all great tips. I will say, Phaedra, I used to tell people that too, to just submit separate requests, but unfortunately, what we've been seeing recently, there's City of Albuquerque and the New Mexico Department of Corrections. Now, if you are someone who has multiple requests pending, they tell you, you have a certain number of requests, we're gonna consolidate them, and everything's overly broad and burdensome.
But that's not legal.
No, it's not, but I'm just saying. Practice.
That was actually proposed in one of the bills that's proposed gutting IPRA, essentially rewriting the entire law, was punishing people who were deemed vexish requesters.
Well, and there are those people, just to be
Consolidating
fair.
and saying that you could only have, what, 5 in a 45-day period, which for someone like myself, or even like a lawyer, I mean, it's
Yeah, that's ridiculous.
insanity, you know, if your job depends on public records. So, you know, they have been wanting to actually impose penalties on people for abusing IPRA, which is just shows that there's a lack of understanding amongst many public employees about who the boss is.
No, but I have to
You
say-
guys, it's us, it's not the elected official.
No, but when you have people that are
Don't let me
using
get back
IPRA
on you.
to try to prove a conspiracy linking a home developer and secret city councilors and money, and they're putting in, you know, tens and dozens of requests. That's an interesting issue because you have to comply with it because yes, the public is the boss, but it is taking up a lot of time that could be spent otherwise. you
Okay,
know?
yes, but we actually have that exact situation in Edgewood, because they're
Okay.
literally doing that. And
Oh,
so everything
see?
that they're putting in, it sounds like that. It sounds like they're being kind of crazy, but they're not. Because it's actually happening, because we have all the proof that it's actually happening. So it's like, that's where it comes to like, yeah, you're totally right, which is, there's definitely vexatious requesters that are trying they're really just trying to really annoy and like hurt the custodians, like really make their job hard.
Because some of those people are winning
A
pretty
lot.
decent judgments.
Yeah, and so one thing I was gonna bring up too is that the idea of lawsuits, and Amanda can talk more about this. But the one statistic I know about lawsuits was in 2019, in New Mexico, there was 1.4 million paid out in lawsuits brought on behalf of like IPRA suits for the NMDOJ and FOG.
That's a lot of money.
That is,
That's a lot of money.
and that's your government's having to pay that.
You know, you're not supposed to go on a fishing expedition to just ask for things, though I think idle curiosity is justification enough.
Well, that is how you get some of your best stories.
Hey, but by this, you don't know what you're gonna find until you look at it.
Yeah.
But by the same token, it's also a good exercise for public officials to be reminded that this is their obligation. As much as it may seem as it's a troublesome or it's taking up time from their real job. Every agency is supposed to have a dedicated records custodian. That is their real job. This is not a distraction from their real job. You pay their salary to do this, so don't feel bad about it.
So I do also, there was one thing I wanted to point out too, which is, in case it's not said, you never have to state why you're asking for a record, ever, okay? So if you want something and you're like, how is it gonna look that I'm asking for this really weird thing? Like, so let's say you want all of the emails between Phaedra and a city councilor, made on that city councilor's phone for doing business with the city. Or not on the phone, but text messages as well. You can totally get that. You don't have to explain why.
Yes.
And the real reason is because you just, you know, like Phaedra's hair so much, you wanna follow her around.
I mean, unlikely.
Well, we have a bunch of questions already, so this is a good one. I think I'll start with this one. Which agencies comply the best and the worst? Each of you can answer that.
Well, I think we mostly hear about the ones that don't comply.
Right.
But I mean, I think that some of the bigger cities, Albuquerque and Santa Fe, sort of they are really a good example of ways that they are complying well, and also examples of ways that they aren't complying well, because they're bigger municipalities, they have a lot of funding and a lot of resources, and so we've seen like good solutions, like for example, City of Santa Fe putting their crash reports online, and now they're able to deal with other requests in a more timely manner. So that's good, but they don't do everything perfectly.
I can answer one. That's the
Yeah.
Valencia County Soil and Conservation District.
Good or bad?
Good.
Okay.
They call us constantly about stuff. And so they are trying so hard to be so ethical and above board. They're like, okay, because they call pretty much every 2 weeks and say, okay, what about this? What about this? That's great to just be like, we want to be as above board as possible because that is important to them. So we definitely have gotten that. We've gotten it from Albuquerque School District, but again, they have in the past also put up barriers to things. So it's just really kind of, we keep getting these questions.
Yeah,
So
I think the worst are jails and prisons and law enforcement.
Not surprised.
And I
That's
think-
my area anyway, so I could confirm that. Department of Corrections, New Mexico State Police are terrible. I mean, they recently gave me a broad and burdensome over and over again when I was looking for a case. And when I finally went to the top and was like, you can't say it's broad and burdensome forever. They said, well, the truth is, and bless the records custodian, because he was trying to be truthful with me, but it probably bit him because it was illegal what they were doing, and I called it out, but, you know, they said broad and burdensome, but the officer just hadn't submitted his report. And it had been 3 months, and they have the 3 days that you're supposed to put your report in. So where is it? And they said, finally, well, actually, the officer hasn't completed the report yet. And I was like, you can't just make something up, I mean, and that's the great thing about this being a law, is that it gives you some recourse when they try to
Wiggle
pull
out
a
of
bait
it.
and switch, or, I will say, you know, not to just be totally negative, but, the environment department does a pretty good job. And, the general services department, risk management, believe it or not, I mean, I think that they maybe got beaten down, but you know, we used to have to really fight tooth and nail to get the settlement agreements that they paid out in the lawsuits. Eventually, they were like, you know what, we can't keep playing this game, and they put them on the Sunshine Portal. I have my questions about whether they're complete on the Sunshine Portal, always and forever, but it's pretty good. And I do have to say, one of the things I get from them all the time, they publish the settlements, so if they pay something out, they're like, it's $1 million, whatever. What they don't publish is the legal costs associated with that. And often they're spending a lot of your money to fight these cases. And so I will ask risk management, how much did you spend fighting this? And I usually include that in my story about the settlement. And I called over there the other day trying to look for some stuff, and I think he might be new. Alexis Johnson, do you know? I know that name from somewhere else, but I guess he's general counsel there now. And he called me up and he was like, you know, we could go all through this, or I could just tell you. And I was like,
I tried that. with
perfect, can you
records
just tell
custodians.
me? And it was $5,000, it wasn't a huge amount, but, if you guys wanna know what it was about, I'll tell you, because it's a little bit funny, you know, the district attorney's office was called on the carpet for using their Facebook page for political purposes during the campaign. There was a complaint filed against them with the state ethics board. The district attorney said, well, it was my spokesperson who did it, she doesn't know any better, because, you know, she used to work at the New Mexican. She literally said this in writing. And
So why'd they hire her?
yeah, so she said, well, you know, she's been giving some materials, we've given her government training in government ethics, and it's not gonna happen again. So when the commission made its ruling, no probable cause, they said that. We can't hold her responsible for every single thing that her employee does. And she's given her training, so we're just not gonna, you know, discipline her for that, which was fine. But then I asked, and I had asked when it originally happened, and I asked when the decision came down from the ethics commission, which was, what kind of training did she get? Where was the training? Where's the sign-in sheet? Where did it occur? How much did it cost to put on the training? And of course, there was no responsive records, and I'll let you draw your own conclusions from that, but you know, they said that's what happened, but there's no proof of it, and that cost us $5,000 because I asked risk management, how much did you spend fighting this in front of the ethics board? How much did you pay the lawyer to represent the DA in front of the ethics board on this issue? And they said $5,000.
So we
Now
know
you
the
know.
name Alexis Johnson because she ran for mayor of Santa Fe.
I think he's a,
But it's a different
is it
person.
a man? I
Yeah,
see it's a man, but,
yeah, but that's why you know the name.
okay.
So that was,
okay.
anyway, that's, it hits. Should there be legislation or funds appropriated to update systems so that access of records would be easier?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Especially because a lot of like really smaller municipalities, rural areas, you know, there's a lot of like small communities in New Mexico that don't have the resources to pay for cloud storage, to put all their records online and that sort of thing. So you really see the more innovative solutions coming from bigger places like Albuquerque and Santa Fe because they have the resources, not just to hire people, but also to pay for software and that kind of thing. So the IPRA requires every public body to employ a records custodian, and not every public body that's subject to IPRA has the means to do that, let alone digitize all their records and make them available. So we think that there should be funding. That would be a good solution.
Okay, that's a great, that's good. That's a good question. So this question asks, I've heard that some activists try to overwhelm the offices with requests to bog down the system. example voting records in 2020 when they were asking, I guess, about people getting signed up to voting and all that kind of thing. So how do you protect from that? Can you? I mean, if you're gonna be responsive.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the reasons that we saw some of the legislation this session that we did is because there's people out there who are perceived to be vexatious requesters and who are just submitting lots and lots of IPRA requests in order to overwhelm the government body who's supposed to respond to them, and then they, are able to sue them successfully and they get responses to each and every one of them that are satisfactory under the law. So I think it is a real concern because, these people are doing this at the expense of everyone else's access. So I think it's something that we're hoping to look at as maybe a task force or a working group that's gonna look at how we could deal with that sort of situation. But to my mind, it seems like we should be looking at approaches like how do we do maybe some sort of criminal or other civil enforcement against this person that's sort of outside of IPRA. Because anyone should be able to access records for any reason. And so even if there are people that are maybe being abusive, how do we deal with them without rewriting public records law? It seems like there should be some solution like
You
that.
should treat the exception, not change the law.
how it works
Yeah.
for
And so
everyone.
that's exactly, and so several of the things that were put into the laws that the bills that didn't go through. One of them was, you can only ask for election records 56 days before the election. And during the election until it's been deemed complete, that's it. So if you wanted to ask for election records from so if that bill had gone through from 2024 right now, and you said, I want to look at elections from 2024, you would have, if that bill had passed, they would have said no. You can only look at those records during the election. Which I don't know how that works, but that is probably how they were trying to respond to that.
Yeah.
And so that's what we're saying is that that was an attempt to legislate for the exception instead of legislating that, but in a way that makes sense.
And there was also a case in which partisan groups wanted voter information and the Secretary of State denied it, and then they ended up having to give it to them. So basically now, because it's a public record, people can find out not who you voted for, but that you voted in a Republican or a Democratic primary, and that's all public record. They also can know where you live, which is, kind of creepy, even if your information is available. And it's fascinating to think about all the people who are buying information or selling it. They get it for free from the state, MVD records that are public or whatever's public, and then they monetize it. So you can sort of see how government's frustrated that they're spending the money to put it out there and they're not benefiting any. And like with immigrants, now there's a law, I don't know if it's gonna pass, but there was a law introduced this session to stop some of the sales of MVD records because they were using it to track down people who might be in the country illegally. So if you had a non-real ID with a, Spanish last name or something, that might tip ICE off and then go, pick you up.
I just wonder how that stuff's gonna work in New Mexico. We're a minority majority state.
I know, but
I mean, like, seriously.
but we have driver's licenses
Trying to find
for
John Garcia for a
immigrants who
comment.
I
aren't.
know, right?
Yeah, no, well, I think they're gonna arrest a lot of the wrong people.
I mean, they're targeting the DEI programs at the University of New Mexico. They're just gonna hurt white people because that would be who it's for. Sorry.
No, that's funny. Besides, they said it was New Mexico State that had the contract, so it could be that the feds, just like ESPN, have mixed up the Lobos and the Aggies. So we have to follow up. This is another kind of to follow up. What are some of the other ways people are trying to weaken or restrict IPRA? So we talked about the laws. I think in my experience, it's just the general, you can have laws and you can also have the person who just takes their time and says, I have to wait. So there's a lot of individual ability to gum up the works if you don't have a government that says, no, we are gonna be transparent. I mean, the poor city of Santa Fe switched its, how they put up their agendas correctly. The system they used for their agendas and public records, and some of the minutes of all the old meetings disappeared. And that wasn't on purpose, I don't think, but it happened. And how do you get it back? And I think eventually it's all gonna go back. But you can't find the things, going through old minutes is a great tool as a reporter. because you can find out who was there, you can get a little summation of the conversation. And I think the public meetings that were online, some of them disappeared. So hopefully they'll get that back. And was that a technical problem or was it, something more sinister?
One thing that we've been talking about, the digitization and sort of, overt attempts to block IPRA. But, to be fair, which, to the government.
It's hard.
To follow Christine's lead. The digitization and the fact that New Mexico is kind of late to that party in some ways, is part of the problem. And so, yeah, there is, learning curve there. And now we have it this way, all the police lapel camera, right? Now that they're required to always wear a lapel cam, that's something that's IPRA-able. And that's something that takes a long time to redact. So you have to look through it, and make sure there's not a dead body in the picture, stuff like that. But, I think, so sometimes it's not on purpose that they're trying it, but they are overwhelmed and they are having a hard time, but putting pressure on the legislature, the agencies to actually put the fundings toward it, I think is where the solution lies. Like court records are a good example. We have access, like a special tier of access as journalists, which I really enjoy because I don't have to go to the courthouse. I can look them up 24/7 anytime. But it also puts me on unequal footing with the public, and I kind of consider myself to be of the public, and that there shouldn't be another tier of access between the public and the government that is the journalists. And it's been about 10 years since they've been talking about putting those records online, because these are public records for the most part. The court records are public, but you have to drive to the building and look at them there in the office. Almost 10 years ago, they told me we just need $2 million for this redaction software, and then we're gonna give the public their access. Here we are, nearly a decade later, and that hasn't happened. If you wanted to write or call the administrative office of the courts, you could put pressure on them to develop systems that would, lessen the pressure on the records custodians, but still make the records public.
And one of the things about digitization is that in the old days, you would go to the courthouse every day to look at the records. So you got to know all the secretaries. Sometimes you'd run into judges or lawyers in the hallway and you got all sorts of stories out of that. And now you look it up and it's more efficient, you save time. But I don't know that you have the relationships that you might have developed.
Yeah, it's interesting when you talk about these people who are pressuring or sort of annoying on purpose. There was a rule made in the First Judicial District Court in response to one of those people who came in and was harassing the clerks, and they were videotaping the clerks and wanting to put it up on YouTube. And so the judge made a rule that you cannot take pictures in the halls of the courthouse anymore. And he and I had a discussion about that because, he's a reasonable person, so he will sit and talk to me, which is more than I could say for a lot of officials. But, he was like, well, the public was in here harassing them. And I'm like, yeah, but you're a public servant, you work with the public. They're not always nice. We don't throw out the baby with the bathwater, so you have to find another way to get through that. So I was in the hallway, and I don't know if you guys know these characters, but Alex Naranjo and Ike DeVargas, two longtime arch nemesis from Rio Arriba County, have been at each other, politically for their entire lives, in their 70s. Ike's who died recently, is trying to get Alex out of office over reinstalling the Oñate statue in Espanola. And on a bathroom break from the hearing, they're embracing each other in the hallway. And I called Cindy and I was like, Cindy, this is an amazing picture. Do I not take it? Do I take it and get in trouble with the judge? And she was like, take it, we'll ask, forgiveness, not permission. And I did. And now Ike's dead,
You'll never get that picture again.
Right, so this death by 1,000 cuts, when people think, oh, it's just a little thing, we don't want these poor clerks to get bothered, but there's a whole bigger thing happening there in public buildings, and we can't allow these little things where they're saying, well, that's inconvenient, or you're annoying us, to let that erode the public's right to see what is being done in their name.
No, I think that came out of a lot of the election stuff, though, when clerks were being threatened with death and things like that. So everything is, you gotta be more secure. And when you're so secure and secretive, people don't get the information they need to know. This is a good question about other organizations that work to prevent the erosion of IPRA or FOIA. The New Mexico Press Association, I think, works with FOG to help. in terms of monitoring the IPRA bills this time?
Yeah, we worked a little bit with them. I would say the ACLU. is
Yeah,
very
ACLU, yeah.
Yeah.
Human Rights Defense Center has won a lot of cases in New Mexico in recent years, going after prison records. And they continue to sue. They continue to spend their own money and sue.
Yeah, I would say anyone kind of working in the civil rights arena, because they're the ones accessing these records to investigate civil rights violations. So anyone in that community.
And there
Sure.
used to be more active national journalism groups that aren't as active now, but there's still the National Association of Hispanic Journalists, Black Journalists, the Indian Association, Native American Association. So there's groups like that that will come in and at least, say support and do that kind of thing.
Professional journalism.
Society of Professional Journalists.
And the Freedom of the Press Association, what's the National Committee for? I'm getting.
Like
old,
responsible press or something like that.
Yeah, they have a really great website and they're a good resource for journalists. You know what I'm talking about, the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press.
Yeah, I think that's
Reporters
right.
Committee for Freedom of the Press. They've actually filed IPRA lawsuits in New Mexico and created good law, especially around this idea that private entities who contract with the government should be subject to IPRA because they hold public records.
So that's a big one.
Yeah.
And one of the things that's interesting in New Mexico is there's things like we can't do we're gonna have a superintendent search soon. So a lot of that is private until you get to finalists, but they keep trying to change that. That comes up like every 3 or 4 years. Like if we let people know who's applying, then everybody won't apply that's good. And really what having a public list of finalists and even semi-finalists does is lets you know that they hired their dumb cousin instead of this really qualified person who didn't get the job. So that's something to really watch for when government agencies try to hide who's in the running for a job.
Just recently, the governor appointed her brother to be a regent at Highlands University. And someone told me he had also gotten a cushy job at Game and Fish. And I requested the applications and the interview notes and the advertising for the job. And as it turned out, Mylan ended up writing the story, which was kind of better because he's a columnist and he can call it out as he sees it. But I gave him everything that I got through IPRA. The guy who got the job, James Lujan, he ended up stepping down from the job at Highlands after we requested the information about how he got his job at Game and Fish. And, full disclosure, there were other candidates and it was advertised, but he was not the most qualified applicant. There were 2 applicants in-house who were more qualified than him. And when I don't know if it was in direct result of us looking into that, but as soon as we started looking into that, he stepped down as the regent at Highlands.
Although it would have been interesting to have an elder student regent because there are so many adults that go back to school. But the thing is, you don't appoint your brother, you wait until the next governor and then they can appoint your brother.
Right.
Is the move, this is a good question, you guys are so smart. Is the move to prioritization in part to destroy transparency? And this is like a national trend. And I would say yes, and it's also to make private companies lots of money. It used to be a joke in New Mexico that the Democrats would hire their cousins, the Republicans would give contracts to their friends. Big fat contracts that would go for years and do that. So what do you think this trend in privatization is going to do to open records, Amanda?
Well, it makes it more complicated for sure, even though the New Mexico courts have said any private business that's providing a public function, either because they've been contracted with the city or county or whatever government agency, or because they've just sort of fulfilled that role in other ways, they're subject to IPRA. But a lot of the times they're not ready to just acknowledge that up front. You have to take them to court in order to prove it. So it makes it a lot harder to get records. Even entities that have already been determined by the Court of Appeals or sometimes the Supreme Court, for example, the UNM Foundation or these private prison contractors, Centurion and Corizon that run prisons or provide healthcare within prisons. The courts in New Mexico have already said, yes, you hold public records and you have to comply with IPRA, but they continue to disregard their obligations under IPRA. So it makes it just a lot more complicated. Unless you have the resources and time to sue them, you're probably not gonna get it. So even though we have these really useful Supreme Court and appellate court decisions from our courts in New Mexico saying that they have to comply, we can't trust them to do that. And we're seeing that at the federal level too now with the Department of Government Efficiency, which last week was declared by a federal court, I think in Washington, to be subject to the federal FOIA open government law. But who knows if they're gonna comply.
Well, like you said, you know, they may not comply, but public officials have at least maybe a little bit of shame or fear that they won't get reelected, or, you know, they're a little bit more susceptible to that kind of pressure. Whereas Verizon, the healthcare company that fought, joined the New Mexican in suing over settlement agreements with inmates, and they continue to deny. It's almost worth it to them just to pay the penalty or to, you know, continue litigating. They don't care about getting reelected. So when you put it in the hands of someone private, then you sort of de-incentivize them, you know, to,
Accountability's not
yeah,
there.
there's no public accountability from voters or taxpayers because they don't care what we think about that. And they have continued to deny those records despite case law that was developed through this lawsuit. And it's the Human Rights Defense Center who has continued to sue them over that.
Yeah, we're gonna have some interesting experiences with immigration centers. You know, if they continue to put more people in detention camps, you know, is any of that public? Do you have a right to know if someone disappeared?
Well,
Do
I
they
asked,
tell you? You
I
know?
think it was Geo Group, because Geo Group has expressed an interest in opening and turning a state prison in Lee County into an ICE detention center. And I asked them, you know, what's your plans and what are they like? And they said, ask ICE. But they don't even pretend to, you know, they're like, just ask ICE what our plans are. And then the FOIA process at the federal level is a lot more complicated and a lot longer. You could wait 2 years to get your information. So it's a way to hide for sure.
Good. Any more questions?
I have a question. How's the state attorney general's office doing when it comes to enforcement assistance?
I would say it's kind of like a mixed bag. One thing that we've been hearing pretty consistently from them is they're just having a hard time staffing that division that deals with these IPRA and OMA complaints. But the people that we have worked with there seem to really want to do a good job and be responsive to people's complaints when they see an IPRA or OMA violation. OMA is the Open Meetings Act. So it seems like this current administration, they've recently sort of caught up with the backlog of complaints and issued a lot of disposition letters that we've seen. We don't always agree with their take on the law, but for the most part, it seems like they're trying to deal with those complaints. So it is a resource that we definitely encourage people to use because sometimes I think just bringing these issues to their attention is helpful. And more often than not, I mean, I haven't heard of a case yet. I think it's happened, but not recently, when the AG finds through their sort of informal complaint process that a public body has not complied with either IPRA or OMA, they'll usually fall in line with that decision and not wait to get sued. And so sometimes that's a better way for people, especially if you don't have an attorney, to get your issue resolved. But depending on who they have working in that office, sometimes you'll get a response pretty quickly, or maybe it'll take months. So I think it just kind of depends on their bandwidth.
But they very much are for the law.
Yes.
So we've never had any communication from them that is, this isn't a law we care about. Everything they've ever talked to us, they're like, oh, absolutely. Like they are, you know, they're 100% behind it. I think it just really has to do with, they just don't have the bandwidth. They're really understaffed, so.
And they're busy in all those federal lawsuits now.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly, literally, they'll tell us that when we were meeting with them, you know, for the legislature, they're like, we have these federal lawsuits going on. So, you know, that's their priority, and we get that, so.
But they do have a specific division within their office called the Government Counsel and Accountability Services, I think. And so they have lawyers and other people who that's their only job, is to look into these OMA and IPRA violations and investigate them.
OMA is the Open Meetings Act. So when we talk about sunshine laws, there's two. One of them is IPRA, which we've been talking about tonight. The second one is the Open Meetings Act, which we brought up in the introduction. So whenever anybody talks about government transparency or sunshine laws, there's always two. One about records and one about meetings. So no matter where you are in the country, at federal level, another state, there's always two.
And the AG has, and so does the district attorney, but I don't think we've ever seen them do that. Under IPRA, they have like the statutory authority to enforce the laws. And so they have these informal like complaint processes that you can start on their website and they'll do an investigation and issue a letter saying what their findings are. But they also have the ability to sue in court. They have the ability to sue different agencies who don't comply and bring them into compliance that way too.
You know, one of our reporters did file a complaint against state police and sometimes in the past we'd see those go, I mean, I think it took them 6 months to acknowledge it, the AG's office, New Mexico DOJ, but they did acknowledge it, and I think sometimes in the past we've seen them say, well, you know, we just send them a reminder about what the rules are, or we gave them some more training. But I think in this case, they have sent out several letters telling the agency to release the records. So it does feel like they're a little bit more aggressive than the previous administration.
We've met with them and they seem very committed to wanting to make it a priority, so.
Open Meetings Acts can be particularly egregious because that's something in real time where they're trying to sneak something by people. And it can be everything from not putting an agenda up within the required hours of the law. And sometimes it's really sneaky. It's not a violation, but if you have a really controversial issue, you put it at the end and you talk until midnight and then you vote when everyone's gotten tired and got home. So there's a lot of ways that they can, in government, whether to save themselves the headache of everyone yelling at them or just because that's the way it flies that evening, there's a lot of ways that they can keep things to themselves if they want to.
So at the Foundation for Open Government, that's the second thing we talk to people about is the Open Meetings Act. And if certain places are following it and if they're not. And it's exactly what Inez said, which is, you know, sometimes they're just trying to get away with something. And so they'll put it in a way, or they'll put it into a closed session, which a closed session is only allowed in very specific circumstances. I think, Amanda, you have a letter that you like, the text is like, you've gotten to the point where it's like the text is just you use it every single time someone goes into closed meeting, like when they're not supposed to probably, because we're just so used to those violations. That like, yeah, keep using the same text over and over again.
Legal, personnel, and property are the reasons that you could go into executive session.
There's a couple of ones, yeah. But they are very specific. We just did one against the Bernalillo County. Because they went into closed session to talk about a statute, which is not a thing. And so
They might get sued later over the statute. They were anticipating.
and anything they talk about or make a decision about in that meeting, it's not, they have to go back and do it again.
You have to take a public vote.
So that's what happened in Las Cruces when the new, when the NMSU regents, was it who it was?
I think so, yeah.
And they made a decision in a closed meeting. And they, it was a closed meeting, they didn't like do the whole procedure correctly according to OMA, the Open Meetings Act. So they had to redo the whole thing because they did it wrong. And so they were forced to do it again, so.
And there's ways that people can break the law that are, you almost don't think about it, but if you're at the grocery store and you see your fellow city councilor and another one comes up and another one comes up, you could have a quorum and start talking about something, and it could be an accident even.
Yes.
Or you can call the next person and do a roll, they call it a rolling quorum, where you decide what you're gonna do one phone call at a time. That's not legal. And if someone catches you out or reports you, you're gonna be in trouble. So there's lots of ways that people try to maneuver behind the scenes if they're not good faith actors. Yes, ma'am.
Does the Open Meetings Act apply to the state legislature?
No, and getting transparency out of that, that's been hard.
Let me tell you about that. So, the Open Meetings Act, the way it's written, in the first paragraph and at the end, it is completely in contradiction with each other. The first paragraph says the legislature does not have to follow the Open Meetings Act. The last part says it does have to follow the Open Meetings Act. So I went last week, I was at the legislature and I thought I have a couple little extra time. I'm gonna find out. We thought, this is what we thought. Well, they clearly, it's supposed to, because the part about them needing to follow the Open Meeting Act is very long and thought out. So it's like, and the first one's just this little tiny mention. So clearly that little first mention is not supposed to be there. That's what I thought, and and so I went to go hunt down the right person to talk to, and that ended up being the legislative council. And so I went to go talk to him and I said, hey, by the way, could we just fix this law so this little part comes out? That's part of their job. And he basically says, no, you have to do it in a bill. And so I said, okay, and so because they don't put out, if under the Open Meetings Act, they're required to put out minutes for every meeting. That would be every committee meeting they have during the legislature, which they have multiple times every single day, and you have to put them out within 10 days. You also have to have an agenda up 72 hours prior, which they do not do. And so we don't have any of this information going all the way back. So you can't look up in a committee meeting how your legislator voted in that committee meeting. So like you have no way of knowing if they voted to pass this law in that committee, and so you can't hold them accountable. So I brought this up and he goes, well, the law doesn't apply to us because it both applies and doesn't apply. That means we get to do what we want, basically is what he said. So Amanda and I have talked about doing a bill for the next legislative session. We don't know that we're going to do it definitely. We have to check with our board of directors, but yeah, that's what it says.
Yes, ma'am.
And the second part of that is, what about the archived webcasts of committee?
So the archived webcasts, so that was the other thing. So they have these webcasts and is your name possibly Ann?
No, my name is Hannah.
Okay, hi Hannah. Because a woman named Ann has your exact same question. So it's very good that we have multiple people asking this. The webcast that they do, so that the thinking was that was going to serve as their minutes, that they could just hold on to the cameras, they'll hold on to that. They only hold on to them for a year. So they cannot serve as minutes, which is a permanent record. So yes, the legislature at this moment is both doing something completely illegal and doing nothing illegal at all.
And getting them to take those committee hearings took years and years of work. And there's still a lot of things that they're doing that aren't public, like how they spread their pork. I don't think they got that. Some of it's public, but some of it's not public. So there's a lot of things they do that they try to keep very close to the vest because that way no one can hold them accountable.
But it's your right, I mean, truly, it's our right as citizens to know how our legislators voted in a committee.
Yeah.
That is the only way it advances or doesn't advance. So if you're interested in what happened, there's a bill in the going through right now, which I don't know where it is exactly, but it's talking about if there is an epidemic among livestock, how do you what information is the public allowed to have? Those people on that bill are working really hard to make it work, but they're also in this desperate situation because of the avian bird flu thing. Bird flu, a blurred is what I called it, that happened earlier this year. That's why they started the bill, because they were unprepared for that. So they worked with us. They've talked with us multiple times. They've really tried to make this bill work. But that's a really, like, if you don't know how your legislator person voted on that, and it gets to the point where it's like, you don't have to get told any information when there's an epidemic in our state, then you need to know how they voted. And that's just a very, very minor example when it comes to one little tiny thing. That's not like a gun thing or something much more huge than that. So, Amanda, did I just do any of that correctly?
Great job.
Okay, thank you.
I was curious to what extent you're running into issues with policymakers in particular using personal devices or encrypted phone apps to skirt IPRA laws and what.
CYFC.
I did have a magistrate judge tell me the other day, I said, well, do you have an email of it? And she said, no, I delete all my emails.
Yeah, see that kind of.
And I was like,
Yeah.
okay, did you just say that to me?
At the very beginning
That's interesting.
of the governor's administration, they had a CYFD secretary who was using an encrypted app, and his new PR guy basically whistleblowed him, and it ended up blowing up, and I think the whistleblower got a bunch of money, and the head of CYFD went back to the Bay Area, where he at one time was a very good lawyer, but he thought he had to keep everything secret.
Okay.
So yeah, I think that's a problem. And I mean, personally, if I was an elected official, I would use my phone my personal cell phone and talk on the phone and never leave a record of
I'm
anything,
pretty sure.
which is not,
We're
you
not
know.
electing you on
Well, I
that.
know, you know it.
You know, Amanda can tell you all the problems.
It's not right.
Well, it's, the way I look at it is if you're using public business and public email, it can always, there's a record. So if you don't want a record of something, use the phone.
But yeah,
Which
okay, but
business
I
should be
can still,
conducted?
I get it, I get it.
still get a record of all the phone calls that you've made, by the way.
Not on my personal cell phone.
Yes, I can.
And if you,
Then I'll have to use my landline.
if you're using a personal device for your public business, those
Then it's
records
public.
are.
It's
are
any
public
discussion of
records.
the public business.
But
regardless
you won't
of
know
the
what they said though, so you could be
Right.
calling
What they
somebody
said.
all the time.
You will know how many times you're calling,
Your assistant principal.
I mean, if
Exactly,
you
yeah.
get
Could we-
sued
could
and
we
it
request the
goes
call
through
log?
everything.
I'm sorry,
Could we request the call log?
Absolutely.
To see who.
Yep. totally can.
From their personal device?
Yep.
Okay.
No, well, okay, if they're doing business,
If
whatever
it's- if
device
it
they're
just
doing business
pertains
on.
to-
Yeah.
Okay.
So,
How do you prove they're doing business on the
Yeah.
personal device?
That's the hard part. It's very hard if you don't already know. If you get a tip,
Yeah.
then you know where to look for. And that's another great use of IPRA, right? Because a lot of times people, public employees, they want to do the right thing. They want to tell you what's going on, but they don't want to lose their job. And so that's one way I'll use IPRA too, is someone says, hey, so-and-so was talking about this contract on their private cell phone on this day, and they sent an email to the commissioner. Then you know it exists, and that's leverage because they're less likely to
You're
not
not,
find it that way.
yeah, unless you know, you're not necessarily gonna get at that with IPRA. So
Yeah.
that's what's tough. I mean, you have, whenever you submit a request to inspect public records, you're relying on that government agency to be truthful about what they have. And that's just the way it is. I mean, and if you have reason to believe that they're not, you can sue them in court and get a judge to look at everything. That's one way. So it's tough. It's not like you're necessarily gonna always get that information, but IPRA does entitle you to it, but it's up to the government to comply with IPRA, so.
And that's where you have to have sources. I mean, that's where if, as a reporter, if people tell you things, you can go to, if you know where to look, you can find them and they have to give it to you. But sometimes if you don't know where to look, it's not gonna happen.
Yeah.
And so always trying to get around that too. So I mean, I'm sure Phaedra, you've done it and I have, and I know Inez probably has, is that you can get around, like if they're telling you they don't have any records that are responsive to your request, then you start asking for the things around that record. Because sooner, I'm giving you some journalism tips, but sooner or later, they're gonna screw up and give you something that proves even in the most indirect way that the record you're asking for exists, and or they'll give you the exact date it exists for. So it takes time and it takes digging, but you can get to it. It just means you have to ask around it though. You can't ask for it directly. And so a lot of times when I'm asking for specific records that I need, and I don't think they're gonna wanna give them to me, I ask for stuff around it first. So I can prove, if it comes to it, I can prove it exists.
And a responsive, no responsive records is also telling for the agency. It can embarrass them. If you say, give us all the emails that you had back and forth about this high dollar contract, and they're like, we didn't have any. I'm like, you had no communications on this, or you can request someone's calendar and they'll show they didn't have any meetings. So what are you doing for your salary then? And, if you're not gonna show us what you were doing and you have no responsive records, what do you do in your office all day if you have no emails and you have no calendar? So, there's ways to
get to it.
Persistent.
Well, do we have any other questions? Anybody?
Does anybody have a burning question that they wanna find out? Just any single thing, not to put you on the spot. If you don't think of it now, you can call or email me at my office. I will lead you through it, or you could do it yourself and share the information with this group.
Yes, ma'am.
Do you think there is any way to get a legislator to sponsor a bill that would clear up the Open Meetings Act?
Yes,
You do?
absolutely.
And while we're on that topic, could we do something about legislation with amendments introduced?
Dummy bills.
No, dummy bills, yes, well, that's a whole nother swamp, Judy. No, when advocates and lobbyists get a whole bunch of stuff. When advocates show up at a legislative committee hearing and there's an amendment to the bill, and the legislators get it, and you can see some of them reading through quickly at times. But the advocates don't know what's in that amendment, and it could be anything. And if it doesn't come out in the discussion, you could be just shooting your organization in the foot.
So when it comes to the Open Meetings Act itself, There's always the hesitation that if we start bringing this stuff up, it's gonna open it up and people are gonna be adding all kinds of crazy stuff to it.
Yeah.
However, I do think it'll be pretty easy for us to find sponsors to it. We know a fair number of people who are very much for it. As far as what you're asking for, adding that as well, it's possible. So part of what we're gonna probably have to do is actually go into negotiations, I would think, with the Legislative Council itself. Because there's no realistic way that the committee can actually put a agenda out 72 hours in advance. That doesn't make any sense.
Oh, no,
But they would be required to if we say in OMA that they have to. And so we are gonna have to negotiate with them to say, okay, what is realistic? Now, right now, they follow, actually, to the minute, they follow the 24-hour rule. They're very good about that. Absolutely. We've been watching bills that up until like the exact 24-hour
No.
minute, it's not posted, and then all of a sudden it's
No.
there.
less than 12. I checked on one committee last week, I think it was, at 10 o'clock before I went to bed. Set my alarm so I could be up dressed and
Right.
respectable at the roundhouse. Got up and the agenda had been changed by 6.
Okay, so that's the kind of thing we probably need to know about as well. The other thing they've been doing though as well is that you'll look for the committee itself and you'll click on the committee to get what its calendar is. Nothing's listed. What you have to do is go into the PDF of the committee. So if you're using the whole online system, it won't show what they're discussing. It'll show it in the PDF. According to the Open Meetings Act, though, they are not allowed to change, they would not be allowed to change it. So we're gonna have to go in negotiations with them.
Why don't they do a bill that's only about the legislature, so that doesn't open up the whole Open Meetings Act?
I mean, that's a possibility as well.
You know,
So, I mean, but again, we're a long way away from this. We haven't even talked to our board of directors about this yet or anything. But I just was like, fortunately, it was the assistant director of the Legislative Council who I talked to, was very entertained that I was pushing so hard on this. And he was like, every good lawyer, when they get like pushback, they kind of like the fight. I was very glad about that, because I was like, wait a second, because he kept saying, historically, we haven't done it. Historically, we haven't done it. And I'm like, there are no exceptions in OMA for historic reasons. So it was like,
But we've all done it.
exactly. He's like, he was so happy I said that. So we will have to discuss it with them. We're a long ways away from it, but that's really good to know. Thank
But
you.
Christine makes a good point that, tinkering with IPRA is a slippery slope, because
Yeah,
it's actually really pretty good. It's
we have one of the best.
elegant in
laws.
its simplicity,
We have one of the best
and
laws in
the
the
more
country,
we
so.
complicate it, the more loopholes are created and all of that. And, just trying to get records in Colorado, one state away, is much harder than it is here.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was really struck with your discussion about funding for these custodians, and it seems to me that a way to kill something is to just deprive it of funding,
Yes.
which we see all the time.
Mhm.
How would one go about getting the legislature to increase funding for?
I think if I had to think about this, and you're gonna have to remind me, I would think that the public bodies that the records custodian works for is gonna always be in charge of their budget. So they would have to write it into their own budgets, and that's gonna be accounted for every legislative body. But the question about tools that would make their job easier and investing in those, that is something that could actually be done. And that is a monetary request they could ask for. And that could be significant. When we met with the Santa Fe city clerk, who, by the way, is one of those, wonderful people who's like really wants to give people records. We talked to her a lot about the redaction software that they have to use to redact for video cameras for the police. And I don't know if anybody here has ever used Adobe Suite, but it's very similar to what you have to do for Adobe Suite when you have to mask people's faces. Anytime anybody leaves the frame, you have to reacquire that person when they come back in the frame, and that's a frame by frame by frame thing you have to do for and these lapel camera videos go on forever. They sometimes will have people go, we need lapel camera footage for every officer for the entire month of May. And so they have to sometimes go frame by frame in order to do this. There's software that is much better than what they have, that it's much more expensive, that would not make, they wouldn't have to do that. And so that's the kind of investment. Because setting the salary or giving them more money, as much as I feel like that's a fantastic idea, that's the purview of all the different various little like all the different, like every county, every city, every town, that's their thing. And they don't like it when you tell them how to use their money, ever. But But giving them more tools
Mhm.
to make their jobs easier, that's a great
So
idea.
like a bill to modernize.
Exactly.
which
Is there a way AI could make things easier for them, looking for keywords in certain things, you know? I mean, who knows? So,
But you do it with an appropriation in a bill of the
Exactly.
legislature. And I think what we've always sort of said is IPRA has all these unfunded mandates.
Yes.
yeah,
Where it's like, you have to have a records custodian, you have to comply with this law, but we're not gonna give you anything to be able to do that. So that is one of the things that could be improved upon.
absolutely, and that's a great idea. And I'm sure they would, the records custodians are very unhappy with fog rating. And I get it, we killed all their bills and we're, so you know, it's actually, let's say we're sorry, we're not.
They're bad.
But at the same time, they have a very difficult job. Some of these records custodians for these smaller places, they're also the city clerk.
Yeah.
It is so much work for them. And so just, you know, they might be doing their best, but every day in and day out, if the, you know, you've heard all the vexatious requesters and everybody else, it's a lot, so.
The bill that is now withdrawn that Kathleen Kate sponsored to really overhaul the entire law was written by the county attorney for Sandoval County.
Yeah.
Essentially.
They were written by
It's his
custodians.
job to
Yeah.
respond to those requests. So like when our editor was reading it, he's like, it seems like there's so much in here that's from the viewpoint of the custodian. And I'm like, yeah, that's because this is the custodian's dream. Everything, the vexatious request, the, you know, $30 per hour, the penalties, like all of that. I mean, they could blacklist you and not give you records for 3 years under that proposal. And these are the sorts of things that the records custodians are coming up with to lighten their load.
And that was 3 bills in one session. It just shows you how they are just so overworked that this is happening. These were these were completely different sponsors for each of these bills. So our job in the next year is to try to start moving forward with the working group, with including the custodians. And just trying to figure out solutions to what's happening for them. That does not include infringing on rights. And we're very dedicated to that because, you know, it took me a while to hear it in the bills, it really did, but after the 3rd bill, you're sitting there going, they just must be desperate to keep putting me, this is a lot of work.
Well, I really
So-
applaud your effort.
Yes. We're gonna have to end. I really appreciate the time you all have spent coming in here and talking to us about all this stuff and it's just wonderful. I think the modernization thing is key, really, to help them out and help us out, but and thank you all for being here.
Thank
This will be the end of our session, and once again, thank you.
You do like this bill to privatize all pictures of crime photos.
I did not see it.
It's just on top. Maybe it's just not. She had a bill that would have